Welcome to Windy Night Stories. Tonight I have two stories by Algernon Blackwood. They're each a little too short for their own video, so I'm putting them together into one. Carlton's Drive and Accessory Before the Fact. Accessory Before the Fact. At the moorland crossroads, Martin stood examining the signpost for several minutes in some bewilderment. The names on the four arms were not what he expected. Distances were not given, and his map, he concluded with impatience, must be hopelessly out of date. Spreading it against the post, he stooped to study it more closely. The wind blew the corners flapping against his face. The small print was almost indecipherable in the fading light. It appeared, however, as well as he could make out, that 2 miles back he must have taken the wrong turning. He remembered that turning. The path had looked inviting. He had hesitated a moment, then followed it, caught by the usual lure of walkers that it might prove a shortcut. The shortcut snare is as old as human nature. For some minutes he studied the signpost and the map alternately. Dusk was falling, and his knapsack had grown heavy. He could not make the two guides tally, however, and a feeling of uncertainty crept over his mind. He felt oddly baffled, frustrated. His thought grew thick. Decision was most difficult. I'm muddled, he thought. I must be tired, as at length he chose the most likely arm. Sooner or later it will bring me to an inn, though not the one I intended. He accepted his walker's luck and started briskly. The arm read, "Over Literacy Hill," in small, fine letters that danced and shifted every time he looked at them. But the name was not discoverable on the map. It was, however, inviting like the shortcut. A similar impulse again directed his choice. Only this time it seemed more insistent, almost urgent, and he became aware, then, of the exceeding loneliness of the country about him. The road for 100 yards went straight, then curved like a white river running into space. The deep blue-green of heather lined the banks, spreading upwards through the twilight. An occasional small pine stood solitary here and there, all unexplained. The curious adjective, having made its appearance, haunted him. So many things that afternoon were similarly unexplained. The shortcut, the darkened map, the names on the signpost, his own erratic impulses, and the growing strange confusion that crept upon his spirit. The entire countryside needed explanation, though perhaps interpretation was a truer word. Those little lonely pine trees made him see it. Why had he lost his way so easily? Why did he suffer vague impressions to influence his direction? Why was he here, exactly here? And why did he go now over Literacy Hill? Then, by a green field that shone like a thought of daylight amid the darkness of the moor, he saw a figure lying in the grass. It was a blot upon the landscape, a mere huddled patch of dirty rags, yet with a certain horrid picturesqueness, too. And his mind, though his German was of the schoolroom order, at once picked out the German equivalents as against the English. Lump and lumpen flashed across his brain most oddly. They seemed in that moment right, and so expressive, almost like onomatopoeic words, if that were possible of sight. Neither rags nor rascal would have fitted what he saw. The adequate description was in German. Here was a clue tossed up by the part of him that did not reason, but it seems he missed it. And the next minute the tramp rose to a sitting posture and asked for the time of evening. In German he asked for it, and Martin, answering without a second's hesitation, gave it, also in German, 6:30, 6:30. The instinctive guess was accurate. A glance at his watch when he looked a moment later proved it. He heard the man say, with the covert insolence of tramps, "Thank you, much obliged." For Martin had not shown his watch. Another intuition subconsciously obeyed. He quickened his pace along that lonely road, a curious jumble of thoughts and feelings surging through him. He had somehow known the question would come, and come in German. Yet it flustered and dismayed him. Another thing had also flustered and dismayed him. He had expected it in the same queer fashion. It was right, for when the ragged brown thing rose to ask the question, a part of it remained lying on the grass, another brown, dirty thing. There were two tramps, and he saw both faces clearly. Behind the untidy beards, and below the old slouch hats, he caught the look of unpleasant, clever faces that watched him closely while he passed. The eyes followed him. For a second he looked straight into those eyes, so that he could not fail to know them. And he understood, quite horridly, that both faces were too sleek, refined, and cunning for those of ordinary tramps. The men were not really tramps at all. They were disguised. How covertly they watched me, was his thought, as he hurried along the darkening road, aware in dead earnestness now of the loneliness and desolation of the moorland all about him. Uneasy and distressed, he increased his pace. Midway in thinking what an unnecessarily clanking noise his nailed boots made upon the hard white road, there came upon him with a rush together the company of these things that haunted him as unexplained. They brought a single definite message, that all this business was not really meant for him at all, and hence his confusion and bewilderment, that he had intruded into someone else's scenery and was trespassing upon another's map of life. By some wrong inner turning, he had interpolated his person into a group of foreign forces which operated in the little world of someone else. Unwittingly, somewhere, he had crossed the threshold and was now fairly in, a trespasser, an eavesdropper, a peeping Tom. He was listening, peeping, overhearing things he had no right to know, because they were intended for another. Like a ship at sea, he was intercepting wireless messages he could not properly interpret, because his receiver was not accurately tuned to their reception. And more, these messages were warnings. Then fear dropped upon him like the night. He was caught in a net of delicate, deep forces he could not manage, knowing neither their origin nor purpose. He had walked into some huge psychic trap elaborately planned and baited, yet calculated for another other than himself. Something had lured him in, something in the landscape, the time of day, his mood. Owing to some undiscovered weakness in himself, he had been easily caught. His fear slipped easily into terror. What happened next happened with such speed and concentration that it all seemed crammed into a moment. At once and in a heap it happened. It was quite inevitable. Down the white road to meet him, a man came swaying from side to side in drunkenness, quite obviously feigned. A tramp. And while Martin made room for him to pass, the lurch changed in a second to attack, and the fellow was upon him. The blow was sudden and terrific, yet even while it fell, Martin was aware that behind him rushed a second man, who caught his legs from under him and bore him with a thud and a crash to the ground. Blows rained then. He saw the gleam of something shiny. A sudden deadly nausea plunged him into utter weakness where resistance was impossible. Something of fire entered his throat, and from his mouth poured a thick, sweet thing that choked him. The world sank far away into darkness. Yet through all the horror and confusion ran the trail of two clear thoughts. He realized that the first tramp had sneaked at a fast double through the heather, and so come down to meet him, and that something heavy was torn from fastenings that clipped it tight and close beneath his clothes against his body. Abruptly then the darkness lifted, passed utterly away. He found himself peering into the map against the signpost. The wind was flapping the corners against his cheek, and he was poring over names that he now saw quite clear. Upon the arms of the signpost above were those he had expected to find, and the map recorded them quite faithfully. All was accurate again and as it should be. He read the name of the village he had meant to make. It was plainly visible in the dusk, 2 miles the distance given. Bewildered, shaken, unable to think of anything, he stuffed the map into his pocket unfolded, and hurried forward like a man who has just wakened from an awful dream that had compressed into a single second all the detailed misery of some prolonged, oppressive nightmare. He broke into a steady trot that soon became a run. The perspiration poured from him, his legs felt weak, and his breath was difficult to manage. He was only conscious of the overpowering desire to get away as fast as possible from the signpost at the crossroads, where the dreadful vision had flashed upon him. For Martin, accountant on a holiday, had never dreamed of any world of psychic possibilities. The entire thing was torture. It was worse than a cooked balance of the books that some conspiracy of clerks and directors proved at his innocent door. He raced as though the countryside ran crying at his heels, and always still ran with him, the incredible conviction that none of this was really meant for himself at all. He had overheard the secrets of another. He had taken the warning for another into himself, and so altered its direction. He had thereby prevented the right delivery. It all shocked him beyond words. It dislocated the machinery of his just and accurate soul. The warning was intended for another, who could not, would not, now receive it. The physical exertion, however, brought at length a more comfortable reaction and some measure of composure. With the lights in sight, he slowed down and entered the village at a reasonable pace. The inn was reached, a bedroom inspected and engaged, and supper ordered, with the solid comfort of a large bath to satisfy an unholy thirst and complete the restoration of balance. The unusual sensations largely passed away, and the odd feeling that anything in his simple, wholesome world required explanation was no longer present. Still, with a vague uneasiness about him, though actual fear had quite gone, he went into the bar to smoke an after-supper pipe and chat with the natives, as his pleasure was on a holiday, and so saw two men leaning upon the counter at the far end, with their backs toward him. He saw their faces instantly in the glass, and the pipe nearly slipped from between his teeth. Clean-shaven, sleek, clever faces, and he caught a word or two as they talked over their drinks. They might have been two tourists, holiday-making like himself, in tweeds and walking boots, and presently they paid for their drinks and went out. He never saw them face to face at all, but the sweat broke out afresh all over him. A feverish rush of heat and ice together ran about his body. Beyond question he recognized the two tramps, this time not disguised. Not yet disguised. He remained in his corner without moving, puffing violently at an extinguished pipe, gripped helplessly by the return of that first vile terror. It came to him with an absolute clarity of certainty that it was not with himself they had to do, these men, and, further, that he had no right in the world to interfere. He had no locus standi at all. It would be immoral, even if the opportunity came. And the opportunity, he felt, would come. He had been an eavesdropper, and had come upon private information of a secret kind that he had no right to make use of, even that good might come, even to save life. He sat on in his corner, terrified and silent, waiting for the thing that should happen next. But night came without explanation. Nothing happened. He slept soundly. There was no other guest at the inn but an elderly man, apparently a tourist like himself. He wore gold-rimmed glasses, and in the morning Martin overheard him asking the landlord which direction he should take for Literacy Hill. His teeth began to shatter and a weakness came into his knees. "You turn to the left at the crossroads," Martin broke in before the landlord could reply. "You'll see the signpost about 2 miles from here, and after that it's a matter of 4 miles more." How in the world did he know? Flashed horribly through him. "I'm going that way myself," he was saying next. "I'll go with you for a bit, if you don't mind." The words came out impulsively and ill-considered. Of their own accord they came, for his own direction was exactly opposite. He did not want the man to go alone. The stranger, however, easily evaded his offer of companionship. He thanked him with the remark that he was starting later in the day. They were standing, all three, beside the horse trough in front of the inn, when at that very moment a tramp, slouching along the road, looked up and asked the time of day, and it was the man with the gold-rimmed glasses who told him. "Thank you, much obliged," the tramp replied, passing on with his slow, slouching gait, while the landlord, a talkative fellow, proceeded to remark upon the number of Germans that lived in England and were ready to swell the Teutonic invasion which he, for his part, deemed imminent. But Martin heard it not. Before he had gone a mile upon his way, he went into the woods to fight his conscience all alone. His feebleness, his cowardice, was surely criminal. Real anguish tortured him. A dozen times he decided to go back upon his steps, and a dozen times the singular authority that whispered he had no right to interfere prevented him. How could he act upon knowledge gained by eavesdropping? How interfere in the private business of another's hidden life, merely because he had overheard, as at the telephone, its secret dangers? Some inner confusion prevented straight thinking altogether. The stranger would merely think him mad. He had no fact to go upon. He smothered 100 impulses, and finally went on his way with a shaking, troubled heart. The last 2 days of his holiday were ruined by doubts and questions and alarms. all justified later when he read of the murder of a tourist upon Literacy Hill. The man wore gold-rimmed glasses and carried in a belt about his person a large sum of money. His throat was cut. The police were hard upon the trail of a mysterious pair of tramps said to be Germans. The end. Carlton's Drive. It is difficult, of course, to estimate the effect of such a thing upon another's temperament. The change seemed bewilderingly sudden. Yet spiritual chemistry is a process incalculable, past finding out, and the results in this case were undeniable. Carlton had changed in the course of a brief year or two, and he dates it from that drive. He knows. He told it to a few intimates only. Those who know his face as it is today, serene and strong, yet recall how it was scored and beaten with the ravages of dissipation a few years before, so that the human seemed almost to have dropped back into the beast, can scarcely credit his identity. Now, its calm austerity, softened by the greatest yearning known to men, the yearning to save, proclaim at a glance the splendid revolution, whereas then the memory is unpleasant, exceedingly wonderful the contrast. His life was inoffensive enough, negatively at least, till the money came. Then, with the inheritance, his innate sensuality broke out. Yet it seemed a prodigious step for a man to take in so brief a time. From that life of depravity that stained his face and smothered his soul, to the brotherhood of devotion he founded, and himself led full charge against the vice of the world. But it was not incomprehensible, perhaps. He did nothing by halves. It was the swing of the pendulum. He was somewhere about 30, his nerves shattered by the savagery of concentrated fast living, his system too exhausted to respond even to unusual stimulant, when he found himself one spring morning on the pavement beside St. George's Hospital. He had been up all night, and was making his way homewards on foot, his pockets stuffed with the proceedings of lucky gambling. And how he happened to be standing at that particular spot, watching the traffic, at 8 a.m, is not clear. Perhaps, seduced by the sweetness of the air, he had wandered, driven by gusts of mood as by gusts of wind. Though he had drunk steadily since midnight, he was not so much intoxicated as fuddled, stupid. He was on the south corner, where the buses stop in their journey westwards. The sun poured a flood of light down Piccadilly. The street was brisk with pedestrians going to work, the hospital side entrance behind him already astir. Across the road the trees in the park shimmered in a wave of fluttering green. The pride of life was in the June air. In his own heart, however, was a loathsome satiety, sign of the first death. In a line with the trees opposite stood a solitary hansom. A faint surprise that it should be there at such an hour jostled in his sodden brain with the idea that he might as well drive home, when, suddenly, he became aware that the man perched on the box was looking at him across the street with a fixity of manner that was both singular and offensive. Carlton felt his own gaze, blear-eyed and troubled, somehow caught and held uncomfortably. The other's eyes were fastened upon his own, had been fastened for some time, sinisterly and with a purpose. Just at this moment, however, a sharp spasm of pain and faintness, due to exhaustion and debauch, shot through him, so that he reeled, half staggering, and, before he quite knew what he was doing, he had nodded to the driver and saw that the horse was already turning with chattering hoofs to cross the slippery pavement. A minute later he had climbed heavily in, noticing vaguely that the driver wore all black. The horse was black, and on the whip was a strip of crepe that fluttered in the breeze. As he got in, too, the effort strained him, but more than that, something that was cold and terrible, like a hand of ragged steel, he described it afterward, clutched at his heart. It puzzled him, but he was too done to think, and he lurched back wearily on the cushions as the horse started forward with the jerkiness of long habit. "Same address, sir?" the man called down through the trap. His voice was harsh like iron, and Carlton, supposing that he recognized a fare, replied testily, "Of course, you fool, and let her rip, to the devil." The spasm of strange pain had passed. He only felt tired to brokenness, sick with his corrupt and unsatisfying life, a dull, incomprehensible anger burning in him against the world, the driver, and himself. The hansom swung forwards over the smooth, uncrowded streets like a ship with a breeze behind her, for the horse was fresh, and the man drove well. He took off his opera hat and let the cool wind fan his face. That drive of a mile to his rooms was the most soothing and restful thing he had ever known. But after a while, braced, perhaps, by the morning wind, he began to notice that they were following a strange route through streets he did not recognize. He had been lolling in the corner with half-closed eyes. Now he sat up and looked about him. Time had passed. He ought to have reached home long ago. They were going at a tremendous and unholy pace, too. He poked open the trap sharply. "Hi, hi," he called out angrily. "Are you drunk? Where, in the name of God, are you driving to?" "It's all right, sir. It's the shortest way. The usual roads are closed." The man's voice, deep, with a curious rumbling note, had such conviction and authority in it that Carlton accepted the explanation with a growl and flung himself back into his soft corner. Again, however, for a single second, that cold thing of steel moved horribly in his heart. He felt as if the ragged hand had given it another twist. Then it passed, and he gave himself up to the swinging motion of the drive. The hansom tore along now. It was delightful. Curious, though, that all the known streets should be up. Positively the houses were getting less, as though he was driving out into the country. Perhaps, too, the feeling of lascier aller that came over him was caused by some inhibition of the will due to prolonged excesses. Carlton admits it was unlike his normal self not to force the man to drive where he wanted, but he felt lulled, lazy, indifferent. Let the fool take his own way, his thought ran. I shan't pay him any more for it. Someone was waving to him from the pavement with a colored parasol. A girl he knew, one of his sort, gay and smiling, tripping along quickly. With a momentary surprise that she should be thus early astir, he smiled through the window and waved his hand. It gave him pleasure to see that she was going in the same direction as himself. The instant he passed her, the horse leaped forward with increased speed, so that the hansom rattled, shaking him a little as it lurched from side to side. "Steady on, idiot," he shouted, "or you'll smash me up before I get to the end." And he was just going to bang open the trap and swear, when his attention was caught by another salutation from the pavement. It was a man this time, running hard. A man who played, drank, and the rest of it even harder than himself. A man who shared his trips to Paris. He was radiant and gesticulating. "Good journey, old fellow," he heard him cry as the hansom shot past. "Hurry up. We're coming too. We shall be there together." Carlton did not quite like this greeting. It reminded him for a second that he was a bit uncertain where the mad driver was heading for. It gave him a passing uneasiness, almost immediately forgotten, however. The pace was too delicious to bring to an end just yet. Presently he would call the fellow to order with a vengeance, but meanwhile, let her rip. His friends were all going the same way. It must be all right. His thoughts, he admits, were somewhat mixed, for great speed destroys calm judgment. It exhilarated, but it also bewildered. The pace, assuredly, had something to do with his mental confusion, for it was terrific. Yet he saw on the pavement, from time to time, more friends and acquaintances, and somehow at the moment it did not strike him as too peculiar that they should be there, all moving hurriedly in the same direction. He had an odd feeling that they all knew of some destination agreed upon, that he, too, knew it, but that it was not playing the game to admit that he knew. Yet about some of them, their hurried steps, their gay faces, their waving hands, there was a queer, fugitive suggestion of sadness, even of fear. One or two touched the source of horror in him even. It hardly surprised him that the horse, steaming and sweating, should start forward with a frightened leap as each figure in turn was sighted and left behind. Perhaps he himself was too much a part of the wild, exhilarating rush to realize how singular it was. Certainly it seemed as though some faculty of his mind was suspended during the drive. But at last, after passing another friend, the horse gave a leap that really frightened him, flinging him against the boards. It was a man, twice his own age, who more than any other had helped him in his evil living, not by doing likewise, by smothering his first remorse with a smile and a sentence. "Of course, my boy, sow your wild oats. You'll settle down later. No man is worth his salt who hasn't sown his wild oats." He was sliding along, a kind of crawl, with something loathsome in his motion that suggested the reptile. Carlton nodded to him. The same second the horse gave its terrible bound. The whip for the first time slashed down on its flanks. He saw the strip of crape, black against the green and sunny landscape. For by now all houses were left behind, and they were rushing at a mad pace along a broad country road, growing momentarily steeper and then downhill. At the same moment he caught his own face in the glass. To his utter horror, he saw that a black veil, crape-like, hung over the upper part, already hiding the eyes, and that it was moving downwards, slowly creeping. The hand of steel turned again within him. He knew that it was death. Yet most singular of all, he instantly found in himself the power to believe it was not there. His hand brushed it off. His face was young, clean, and smiling once more. And now the hansom flew. The horse was running away. He heard the driver shouting to it, and the shouting sounded like a song. The man was drunk, after all. Mingled with his song, too, came a confused murmur of voices behind, far away. What in the world did it all mean? Dashing aside the little curtain, he looked back out of the window, and the first thing he saw was a face pressed close against the glass, staring straight into his eyes with a beseeching, pitiful expression. Good God! It was the face of his mother. He swore. The face melted away, and then he saw that the whole country behind him was black, and through it, down the darkened road, ran the figures he had passed. But how changed! The girl was no longer gay and smiling. Her face was old, streaked with evil, and with one hand she clutched her heart as she ran, trying in vain to stop. Behind her were the others, worn and broken, with bloodshot eyes and toothless gums, all grinning dreadfully, all racing down the ever-steepening descent, yet all trying frantically to stop. One or two, however, still ran with a brave show as if they wished to, debonair, holding themselves with a certain appearance of dignity and pleasure. And some, the old man of the wild oats sentence at their head, were close upon the hansom, pushing it. The face of his mother stood once more upon the glass, between their evil outstretched hands and himself, but less close, less visible than before. Carlton knew a spasm of pain that was terrible. He sat up. He flung open the doors, and his eyes measured the leap. But the faculty of mind that had all the time been in suspension returned a little, and he saw that to jump was impossible. He smashed the trap open with his fist and cried out, "Stop, I tell you, stop." "Can't stop here," the driver answered, peering down at him out of the square opening that let in darkness. "It's not allowed. It's not usual either." "Stop, I say," thundered Carlton, trying to rise and strike him. But the driver laughed through that square of blackness. "Can't be done, sir. You told me same address. There's no stopping now." Carlton's clenched fist was close to the man's eyes when the fingers grew limp and opened. He sank back upon the seat again. The face peering down upon him was his own. And in this supreme moment it was that some secret reserve of soul, hitherto untainted, stirred into life, he declares, by the sight of his mother's face at the window, rose and offered itself to him. He accepted it. His will moved in its sleep and woke. "But I say you shall stop," he cried, catching the reins in both hands, and, when they snapped, seizing the rims, and even the spokes or the wheels. His great strength acted like a brake. The hansom reeled, shook, then slackened. It was a most curious thing, but the force that twisted his heart with the hand of ragged steel seemed to lend him its power. His will moved and gripped, the machinery groaned, but worked. Carlton did nothing by halves. He put his life into his efforts. The skin was torn like paper from his hands. The hansom stopped with a trembling jerk and flung him out upon his face in the mud. The same second he saw the horse and driver, both torn from their fastenings, whirled past him overhead to disappear into a gulf that yawned dreadfully under his very eyes, blacker than night, deeper than all things. And when, at length, he rose to his feet, he found that he was tied with bands of iron to the shafts. Slowly, with vast efforts, groaning and sweating, he turned and began painfully to reclimb that huge and toilsome ascent, dragging the awful weight behind him towards the light. For the glare that suddenly broke through the sky was the sunshine coming through the window of the hospital room, St. George's Hospital, where they had carried him when he fainted on the pavement half an hour before. The end.